Welcome to this section of my lectures on motivation, this one an introduction to theories of motivation. The goals for this talk is, first of all, to start off by defining motivation, and then to talk about two theories of motivation, both of which have, I think, good evidence supporting them, and both are applicable to what we do as speech pathologists. I think it's important to really have a good understanding of the theories underlying different motivational interventions and the principles that are described in those theories. Once we understand those concepts and principles, then we really understand why we're going to be doing something counseling-wise during our sessions. And of course, we'll have ideas of not only what to do, but how to modify what we do to meet the specific needs of our clients. So I guess we should start off by asking, why should we know theories of motivation? To me, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? And that is that we should understand theories of motivation and motivation in general because we think it's important. Right? For example, as therapists, I think we interpret our patients' successes and failures oftentimes in terms of how motivated they were. We make important treatment decisions based off of motivation. Many clients are discharged from therapy because they were perceived to not be very motivated. And our patients actually think that motivation is important too. In the few times that we've bothered to ask them, they've indicated that motivation is very important to their rehabilitation. Now, for whatever reason, there is almost nothing written about motivation in speech pathology land. Why? That's the eighth mystery of the world. But that being said, I think that we can read about motivation and motivation interventions outside of our field and feel fairly confident that we can translate those findings and those methods into what we do. And the reason for that is because motivation is a kind of universal psychological state. The things that influence our motivation when we're engaged in sports, in academics, in our work life are not substantially different than what motivates people during speech therapy or the principles involved. So let's start off again at the beginning talking about what is motivation. Here's some quotes. The first one from Gorman, a text on motivation and emotion. And he says, "In many ways, the study of motivation is the study of psychology itself. Motivation is an attempt to explain the why of behavior." So I added this quote because I think it captures how broad the scope of motivation is, in the sense that we could argue that motivation is involved in every intentional act. Now, some motivated behaviors are driven by physiological needs, like the motivation to eat. We're going to be talking about the kinds of motivations that are formed by more cognitive goals. And so this second definition kind of captures, I think, a better definition for us in terms of what motivation is. And this is from Eccles and Wigfield. They say the Latin root of the word motivation means to move. Modern theories of motivation focus more specifically on the relation of beliefs, values, and goals with action. Not really a definition, but it gives us a sense of the fact that what it very much influences motivation is our beliefs, the values that we have, and our goals, or what we value. The final definition here from Ryan and DC, nice, brief motivation, simply says to be motivated means to be moved to do something. There are many definitions of motivation, and in fact there was a paper written in around 2004, 2005 that was all about all of the different definitions of motivation. When that author looked at all of these different definitions, he kind of identified two main themes to most definitions. And that is that motivation is a kind of energy. But it's also a kind of energy that is focused. It's goal-directed. In therapy, I think we could say, yes, motivation is a kind of energy that moves people to do things. I think we could also say that what fuels that energy are people's reasons for acting. Now, when we talk about reasons for acting, or we talk about motivation, we're going to differentiate between amount of motivation and kind of motivation. So most theories of motivation see motivation as kind of a unitary thing or state, in the sense that what determines whether or not people act and what determines whether people persist in their goal pursuits, in other words, how motivated they are, is the strength of their motivation. Okay? Another theory that we're going to talk about, and really the only theory that makes a different kind of distinction, self-determination theory, says that yes, the amount of motivation is a factor, but what's maybe even more important is the kind of motivation that we have, or the quality of the motivation that we're experiencing. For example, are we feeling pressured to act? Is that our experience of motivation? Or is our desire to act, does it freely arise from within and something that we genuinely want to do? So let's start off by talking about self-determination theory. Self-determination theory, I would say, is my primary guide when I think about what to do in clinic. I like self-determination theory not just because it has a lot of empirical support behind it, but because it's a very broad theory. In other words, it covers a lot of the topics that arise during rehabilitation. So it addresses not just something like what is a motivating goal, or how do people's beliefs influence their motivation, but it also addresses the influence of the relationship between the clinician and therapist and how that can influence motivation. Really, when we look at self-determination theory and the kind of studies that are done that test its concepts, we see studies on parenting, academics, sports. Really, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a domain of activity where self-determination theory hasn't been explored. Self-determination theory is called an organismic psychological theory, and what we mean by an organismic psychological theory is that it's interested in innate psychological needs and desires those psychological needs that cross cultures, that cross age groups, etc. Now let's start talking about some basic concepts in self-determination theory, and we'll start with the idea of psychological needs. In self-determination theory, psychological needs are kind of thought of like physiological needs in the sense that they're innate. Everybody has more or less the same physiological needs, nutrition, etc. And B, that in order for us to experience an optimal amount or kind of psychological well-being, that we need these needs to be satisfied. Sometimes these psychological needs are referred to as, in the self-determination theory literature, as psychological nutriments, kind of suggesting that like physiological nutriments, they nourish us. We'll talk as the lecture goes on about the different ways that satisfying these psychological needs can influence motivation, but at its core, we could say that because these are innate needs, that we will be motivated to do those things that just happen to satisfy those needs. Okay. All right, so let's start with the first need, the need to feel autonomous, the need for autonomy. And that just basically means that I feel that I have choice, that the things that I do are things that I freely choose to do, that I want to do, and that I do without any feeling of external pressure. Okay? Just as a matter of clarification of terms, when we say autonomy, we're not talking about independence, right? Independence is just a description of function, whether I can do something without assistance, okay? One can be completely dependent on others, but that be a choice, and so still feel as if they are autonomous, or that the decision to be dependent on others was an autonomous decision. The next need is the need of competence. And here, what we're talking about is more than it's not really about ability, so to speak. It's about our experience that we're able to meet challenges that are important to us. Okay? And so being able to do something that is mundane and unimportant doesn't necessarily satisfy our need for competence. We want to feel effective at doing those things that are important to us. In a general sense, we could say that the need for competence is akin to the need that we have to feel that we're continuing to grow as people, and grow in different ways, whether it's growing in our skills at our job or growing in our our personal development. The need for competency, as we'll see, is kind of met when we are successful at things that we perceive to be somewhat challenging. And then finally, the need for relatedness, the need to feel that others care about us, and importantly, that they care about us unconditionally, and that we have other people that we care about. A recent study that I think is one piece of evidence suggesting that these psychological needs are innate. It's a study done by Chen et al. In 2015, and they surveyed a little over 1,000 adolescents from 4 different cultures and regions: China, Belgium, Peru, and the USA. And they surveyed them in 2 directions, basically. One was to get a sense for whether or not these adolescents' three basic psychological needs were being satisfied, and number two, how important was it to these adolescents that these needs would be satisfied. and as examples of scale-like questions that address, are your needs being satisfied, we might ask people something like, I feel my choices express my true self. As far as satisfying autonomy, a question related to relatedness might be, I feel close and connected with other people who are important to me. And a competence question might be, I feel I can successfully complete difficult tasks. Examples of the questions they were asked in terms of, are these needs important to you, are questions such as, for autonomy, how important is it that you manage to create a lifestyle where others no longer pressure you and you feel free to do what you really want to do? For relatedness, how important is it that you manage to feel more liked and accepted by those you care about and feel less separation from them? And finally, for competence, how important is it that you manage to become better at some activity that is important to you and feel less inept and incompetent? So two findings in general that support this notion that these needs are universal and innate. First of all, it did not matter which of these cultures you were in, whether you were in a more collectivist culture like in China or a more individualist culture like in the United States, whether or not your need to feel autonomous was satisfied and your other needs correlated with your psychological well-being. And also that it did not even really matter whether or not you indicated that meeting these needs were important to you. That those individuals who stated that these needs were relatively unimportant, if their needs were not satisfied, it correlated with other measures that were taken from them that were about their overall psychological well-being. The next concept, important concept in self-determination theory, is internalization. And internalization is a concept that's found in other psychological theories. According to DC and Ryan, the co-founders of self-determination theory, internalization is the process through which an individual acquires an attitude, belief, or behavioral regulation and progressively transforms it into a personal value, goal, or organization. And so here, I think we can see that as therapists, we're oftentimes overtly or covertly wanting our patients to adopt certain attitudes about therapies, certain beliefs about their abilities, about the value of rehab, about the need to be patient, about the need to appreciate small gains that will accumulate gradually over time, of the rationale behind treatments, the rationale behind adopting a particular strategy. The list goes on and on and on. And so I think it's easy to see how internalization is a big part of the kinds of motivation and motivated behavior that we want to see in rehab. And when we talk about internalization, we can think about beliefs, values, practices that are internalized to a deep extent. In other words, they're internalized to the extent to which they're kind of integrated with a person's sense of self, compared to being internalized in a more shallow way, so that a belief or a suggested practice becomes more of a should in somebody's head rather than something they genuinely self-endorse. And internalization is, according to self-determination theory, an innate human psychological process. And I think it's pretty plain to see that it plays out in the fact that most of us, to one degree or another, adopt the values, beliefs, and practices of somebody, often of those people who are close to us, family, friends, or other people that we perceive to be important in our lives. How do we facilitate good, healthy, integrated internalization? Well, we tend to adopt the beliefs and values of others who we feel a sense of connectedness with. We tend to adopt values, beliefs, and behaviors when we really grasp their rationale. We have a belief that we can live up to them, that we can practice them successfully. And finally, we adopt them when we truly feel that it is our choice whether or not we do. And we aren't feeling pressured in any way to do so. Overall, satisfying the psychological needs tends to promote deeper internalization. People will tend to pursue goals, activities that support, that satisfy their basic psychological needs. And satisfaction of these needs overall tends to promote a sense of psychological well-being and vitality. So satisfying these needs in the context of therapy not only has a potentially positive influence on motivation, but it has a positive influence on the person in general. And I think that, at least from my own experience, when that is achieved in the context of therapy, then a whole host of positive, there are a whole host of positive side effects, but not the least of which is that our patients begin to interpret what is happening to them in more of a positive light. So we've covered a couple basic concepts, psychological needs and internalization, and now we can begin to talk about different forms of motivation, namely autonomous and controlled forms of motivation. But first, and this can get a little bit confusing, but hopefully as I continue to go through this section, it'll become a little bit clearer to you. So, we can think in terms of autonomous forms of motivation, which is basically I'm doing something because I genuinely want to do it. And controlled forms of motivation, which is I'm doing something because I feel some kind of pressure to do so. Okay, so we can kind of have that dichotomy. We can also think in terms of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And what we mean here is intrinsic motivation is when we do something because the act itself is reason enough for doing it. Right? In other words, we do something because the act of doing it is enjoyable, interesting, or satisfying. Okay? To use an obvious example, people go dancing because they simply enjoy dancing, not because they expect after dancing is over that they will have achieved some kind of outcome. Okay? Hence the intrinsic nature of the motivation. The behavior itself is self-motivating, Whereas with extrinsic motivation, the reason we're acting is because we value the goal, the outcome of whatever the behavior is. We often might not find the activity particularly interesting or enjoyable. School is often that way. We don't enjoy every assignment, every exam we have to study for, right? But overall, we very much value the outcome that's awaiting us, getting our master's degree, becoming a therapist, etc. And much of adult life is kind of guided by extrinsic motivation. So coming back to intrinsic motivation, in children we see this in their exploratory behavior, play. These are examples of intrinsic motivation. When we talk about contingencies, as I do here in point number 2, where I say that we do something without any external contingency, and a contingency means a reason, an external reason. Right? Oftentimes, it appears that intrinsic motivation is most likely to show up, is going to be the strongest when we are engaged in activities that are of our choice, the need for autonomy is satisfied, and when the task has an element of challenge to it, but something that we feel like we can succeed at the same time. That's what we would call optimal challenge. Think about games, right? Whether they be video games or puzzles, I think they're often good examples of this notion of optimal challenge, in the sense that they can be difficult, but we kind of believe that we can accomplish them. Intrinsic motivation in the literature has been shown to have lots of benefits. When we are intrinsically motivated, we are more engaged, we put in more effort, we will persist more in the face of various challenges or the occasional failure. Overall, our adherence to a schedule of activity is greater. There's a greater degree of creativity associated with intrinsic motivation. When we're intrinsically motivated to learn something, we learn at a deeper, more conceptual manner, as opposed to more kind of memorization, kind of surface level. And in general, when we are experiencing intrinsic motivation, we tend to have a sense of vitality and well-being, and we're energized by things that are intrinsically motivating. Now, of course, the question becomes is, should we try and make our therapy, rehab, intrinsically motivating? I'm not actually really sure about that. I think the best we can hope for is that, at least in my experience, working with the adults that I work with, is that therapy is occasionally intrinsically motivating. And I think that what my patients are experiencing is not necessarily enjoyment, but they have a genuine interest in the activity and a sense of satisfaction from doing well in, let's say, their home practice or something like that. But, I think it fluctuates. I think oftentimes, they don't really enjoy their home practice or whatnot, but they have very strong reasons and goals in mind. So as we're going to talk about, extrinsic motivation is not bad. It kind of has a bad rap. And it has a bad rap because in its extreme forms, it's associated with people acting in order to avoid punishment or to sustain rewards from others. Okay, but what this chart here tries to illustrate is that there's a spectrum of motivation from controlled forms of motivation to autonomous forms of motivation. So let me briefly talk about this spectrum a bit. Now first, at the far left-hand edge here we have in black amotivation. And amotivation is not a kind of motivation. It's not motivation. People aren't motivated. And we'll see this in rehab when people don't value the goals that therapists have set for them, when they don't believe that the therapy they're being asked to do will result in them achieving a goal, even one that they value. Or, yeah, so those two basic reasons. There's the third, and I'm blanking on it right now. I apologize. So now when we move into kinds of motivation, we can have extrinsic forms of motivation, right? People acting in pursuit of a goal for very controlled reasons. Again, the prototype of controlled reasons is to avoid punishment or gain some reward. So does that happen in rehab? It sounds a bit extreme, avoiding punishment. Yes, it does. And I'll give you some examples. So many times I've seen therapists, physicians, etc., basically tell somebody in an acute rehab situation that they need to begin to participate more in rehab or they will be discharged home or to a nursing home. So that is essentially a threat of punishment if a person doesn't act. Now here, the motivator, the goal is not to get better in a way. The real motivator is not to be discharged home prematurely. The patient may, for example, be participating in PT, but not in OT and speech because they value the PT. They want to stay there for the PT, but not for the speech. What about reward? Many times in more kind of implied ways, I've seen where I think patients go along with therapists' recommendations and participate in therapy more because they're seeking the approval of their healthcare providers, the speech pathologists, their physicians. In other words, I think the thinking goes something like, if I'm not a good patient, my doctors and other providers won't care as much about me, and the kind and quality of treatment that I get will be somewhat diminished. And you know what? That's kind of right. There's a qualitative study. I reference it early on in this lecture by Kaufman and Becker, and what they found in interviewing rehab professionals, OT, PT, and speech, is that these therapists acknowledged that they devoted less energy to people that they deemed to be less motivated. Moving to the right, we have another form of controlled extrinsic motivation, something we call introjected regulation. And what introjected regulation is that the pressure is not coming from outside anymore. The pressure is coming from within, right? It's pressure that patients put on themselves, okay, to work towards a specific goal, to participate in therapy. And that sounds like, well, that's what we want. We want, people to motivate themselves. Well, it may be better than what I first mentioned, which is what we call external regulation. But it's still not an optimal form of motivation because it tends to be experienced more as a should, that voice in our head that tells us that we should do this, even though we don't really want to. And some of the associated feelings that go along with this form of motivation are pressure put on oneself, guilt and shame if we, in a kind of a somewhat of a diminishment of self-worth if we don't adhere to the program. And in general, it's believed that this form of motivation reflects something someone has internalized, but in a shallow fashion, and that's what we call an introject. Is this belief, practice, value that is internalized, but not really integrated into the sense of self. Moving more rightward, we get into autonomous forms of extrinsic motivation. And there are a couple here. I'm not going to spend time kind of carving out the details of each. I think giving them an overall description is good enough. Essentially, what this means is that with an autonomous form of extrinsic motivation, I'm participating in therapy, not because I find that therapy is particularly fun, enjoyable, or interesting even, but I really want something. I really want to achieve my speech goal, and that is very important to me and does reflect something meaningful, right? Now, in the first stage of extrinsic, autonomous form of motivation, this is when our patients are really genuinely self-endorsing why they're doing what they're doing, right? You can kind of observe that in the patient who, unprompted by us, spontaneously gives voice to why they're doing what they're doing, and gives voice and spontaneously talks about the value of therapy to them and their home practice. Now, sometimes patients will really deeply internalize the values and goals of rehab so that they become kind of a part of their identity, their sense of self. And this most autonomous form of extrinsic motivation is what is called integrated regulation. Finally, at the most right end of the spectrum, we have intrinsic motivation, which is the prototype of autonomous motivation. Now, it's important to remember that people may be experiencing kind of more than one kind of motivation at any one time. The important thing to remember, I think, clinically, or the important thing for us to try to understand is which one is predominant, right? Overall, is this a person that we get a sense is genuinely autonomously motivated for therapy, or is it on average more of a controlled feeling that they're having. Autonomous forms of motivation, like intrinsic motivation, the data we reviewed on intrinsic motivation, is associated with a whole host of positive outcomes: superior goal, progress, greater persistence in the face of adversity, better coping, deeper learning, generally just better task performance, and an improved sense of well-being. The next theory we're going to talk about is social cognitive theory. Social cognitive theory, authored by Alfred Bandura, a Stanford professor. I believe this theory, the first paper on this from Bandura beginning to develop his theory was maybe published in the late 60s, early 70s. And this theory was important to the extent to which it kind of established a new way of thinking about motivation, in the sense that before then, motivation was studied, at least, and discussed more in terms of people's physiological drives, their instincts, or in a kind of a behavioralist Skinnerian way, that people's actions and their motivations were more a result of different reinforcements and conditioning. But Alfred Bandura said no, people have agency. People guide their own development. They consciously set goals for themselves, and they plan how they're going to achieve those goals, and they believe that they can achieve them, and this guides their motivated behavior. He also said that people's level of motivation, affective states, and actions are based more on what they believe than what is objectively the case. And I think this is really important for us to appreciate, and that is that, well, I'll give you an example. You can have two patients, let's say with aphasia, both an equal degree of severity. One person believes they're doing well, and one person thinks they're doing horribly, right? Although on paper, they are the same, so to speak. I've seen patients who do quite well, can pass for normal, except when you speak to them for a long time, or you have a trained ear, so to speak. And yet they will tell you that they can't speak. I had a client like that recently. She would very fluently tell me about how she could not speak, and why she does not go see her friends anymore, why she stays home, etc. So in that woman's case, her beliefs about her abilities were, I think, distorted. Yet these beliefs greatly affected her motivation to do different things. And as we'll talk about in a bit, these beliefs tend to not just affect our motivation to do things, but if we do pursue goals, they will influence how we interpret our successes and failures along the way. In social cognitive theory, the processes which are believed to contribute to motivation are self-efficacy, which I'll define in a bit, outcome expectancies, the kind of outcomes we expect, The nature and quality of goals. For example, is a goal perceived to be too difficult? Is it perceived to be too easy? Or is it perceived in a kind of Goldilocks way, be just the right level of difficulty? Is a goal short term? In other words, do you anticipate success in, within the next week or two? Or is it a very long-term goal and you don't expect to reach it for quite some time? There are a number of characteristics that will make goals more or less motivating in terms of social cognitive theory. And then, of course, the value and importance that we place on any particular activity or goal. We're going to focus on self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is when we look at people writing about making use of social cognitive theory in rehab and healthcare in general, the focus is almost solely on self-efficacy, and actually Bandura has kind of a mini theory inside of social cognitive theory called self-efficacy theory. And according to Bandura, self-efficacy is, well, in his words, perceived self-efficacy refers to beliefs in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of action required to produce given attainments. So basically, what he's saying there is that self-efficacy is kind of like our confidence in our ability to do the things we need to do to achieve some end, right? To perform at a certain level or to achieve a particular goal. Okay. Now, Bandura goes to great pains to say that self-efficacy beliefs are very task and context specific, versus self-efficacy is not kind of some kind of global confidence that we feel that we meet people like that who just seem to have a confident personality, let's say. To illustrate in the most concrete way how self-efficacy beliefs are task and context specific. Imagine that there are two rocks in this room, a small rock and a quite big rock, right? Well, I'll probably have a high degree of self-efficacy that I can lift the small rock. But I might not have any self-efficacy confidence that I can lift the large rock. And so here we have our task specificity. Now, let's say I got a really good night's sleep last night. I'm feeling really strong. I may believe I can lift that large rock. However, if I pulled an all-nighter or I'd been sick recently and I don't feel too strong, I may not believe that I can lift that rock, and so it's context specific. I may believe that I can speak fluently and when I'm giving a speech, when I'm just practicing by myself, but standing in front of a crowd, I may not feel confident that I can be really fluent. Again, an example of context-specific beliefs. And we see this all the time in many of our clients. They tell us that they're more fluent in these situations with family and close friends, for example. But when they get in a group of people, talking amongst a group of people or to strangers or authority figures, their speech goes to pot. And according to Bandura, self-efficacy affects our behavior in a reciprocal fashion. And what he means by that is kind of like the person who's about to go up and talk in front of a large group of people. in their hotel room, they gave that speech and it was perfect and fluent, right? But they don't have any confidence that they can do that in front of an audience. And so there is anxiety associated with giving that talk. And that anxiety influences their performance. And they do poorly. And now they interpret that poor performance as a confirmation of their lack of ability. So self-efficacy affects motivation in the sense that we don't set goals for ourselves that we don't think that we can achieve. We avoid tasks that we don't believe we can perform successfully. So people will tend to be more motivated towards those goals and tasks that they have a high degree of self-efficacy about. They will tend to persist more at those tasks even if they have difficulty along the way, because in terms of interpretation, what we see is that when people have high self-efficacy and they have some difficulty, they have some failure in their goal pursuit, they interpret those failures in a positive light, in the sense that they may tell themselves that they just need to try harder next time, or employ a different kind of effort, or maybe come at the task from a different angle with a different strategy, or maybe simply that they just had a bad day and tomorrow they'll do better, or they just need a bit more practice. Now, on the flip side, someone who has low self-efficacy towards some pursuit, if they do pursue it and they experience some failures, they're more likely to interpret those failures as a confirmation of their lack of ability. According to Bandura, self-efficacy beliefs are formed through 4 sources of information. The first and most important is mastery experience, and that just means that if I've been successful at some task or goal pursuit, either identical to the one I'm about to start or like this new goal in relevant ways, right? Then I'm likely to have a high belief that I can do this, achieve this goal, perform this task. Vicarious experience, if I see somebody who I judge to be like me in important and relevant ways, achieving that goal, performing that task accurately, then I'm going to have some confidence that I can do it. So for example, if I saw somebody who was twice my size lift that large rock, that's not going to increase my confidence that I can do that. But if I see someone the same size as me lift that rock, then they are like me in ways relevant to that task. I am going to believe that I can do it. And so in the first case with mastery experience, I think we can already begin to see that this common notion in therapy that we need to ensure that our clients have a certain amount of success is right? And it's right for motivational reasons. The notion that we want good role models for our clients in, say, let's say group therapy, right? We want people in our aphasia group who have achieved some success in rehab. Well, I think there's something to that. Bandura also says that verbal persuasion from others can influence self-efficacy, although he goes on to point out that it's one of the weaker forms of self-efficacy information. I think it's the one we often rely on the most. And he says that if it does work, it usually is only effective when it comes from really trusted sources. Of course, that speaks to, do you have a good relationship with your client? And then finally, physiologic and affective states. The information that we get, the sensations that we have in our body, will influence our beliefs. As I mentioned, if I got a very poor night's sleep and I'm not feeling very energetic, that's a physiologic state. And that physiologic state is going to influence my confidence that I can lift that rock. This kind of speaks to, I think, sometimes a certain amount of education we have to do with our clients about helping them understand that, yes, different physical and emotional states will influence your performance. But there's a difference between something influencing your performance and jumping to the conclusion that when you had a high degree of anxiety and you made many errors speaking to a group of people, that means that you can't speak, right? That's a kind of a leap that we don't want patients to make. We want them to, as much as possible, accurately interpret their performances. Other relevant points about self-efficacy and motivation is that when we experience success and self-efficacy beliefs are heightened, we will tend to choose more and more challenging rewards, according to self-determination theory, in order to experience greater degrees of reward. So the experience of mastery kind of is always causing us to up the ante on ourselves a little bit. On the other hand, frequent failure to meet goals tends to lead to discontent and a lack of motivation. And in general, persons with high self-efficacy are more optimistic about therapy and tend to perceive therapy more as a very positive change mechanism rather than something that they need to do. Studies out there suggest that self-efficacy beliefs predict adherence to rehab recommendations. It is correlated with treatment outcomes. It predicts or is correlated with mood and better quality of life in TBI, stroke rehab, spinal cord injury rehab. And it predicts better lifestyle health behavior change. There's actually the self-efficacy theory is probably the most commonly used motivational concept/theory that's been applied to healthcare and rehab in general. Another concept in social cognitive theory is outcome expectancies. And outcome expectancies is a little bit different than I think what you think it might be, in the sense that outcome expectancies are not, let's say, whether I will win a race, right? So that's my goal is, will I win the race, right? So winning the race is not an outcome in Bandura's, the way he talks about it. My confidence that I can win a race or my confidence that I can improve my speech, those are self-efficacy expectations, right? The confidence that I can achieve something. An outcome, according to Bandura, is something that flows from that achievement. And Bandura breaks them down into three forms: physical, social, and self-evaluative. So if I win the race, I may expect that I'll feel elated. Okay? The physical. I may have an expectation that I'll get approval from others, the social aspect. And I may expect that my opinion of myself, my self-worth, will be heightened. Hence the self-evaluative. And so I think this is a kind of a useful little addition to think about, another way of thinking about what an outcome might be. That being said, really very, very little written about outcome expectancies and motivation in general, particularly in rehab or healthcare. All of the focus tends to be on self-efficacy beliefs and expectations, which I think is understandable. It seems that the studies that have looked at outcome expectancies and its influence on motivation say that something like this, and that is, if we're about to engage in a very novel task, right, a task where we don't really have the kind of past experience that would allow us to make a very accurate prediction about whether we'll succeed or not, then our outcome expectancies, if they're very positive, will probably be more of the driving force behind our motivation. Once we get a little bit of experience, let's say I have no idea what to expect from rehab. I've never had an aphasia before, so never been in speech therapy before. But now I've been in therapy for about a month. I have an idea of what it's like. I can use those experiences. Hopefully I've had some mastery experiences to begin to make predictions and to form, again, hopefully positive self-efficacy beliefs. Now, our self-determination theory and self-efficacy theory, are they in any way at odds with each other? I don't really think so. Actually, there have been a few papers written where people essentially kind of made a hybrid of the two and measured the outcomes of a motivation intervention based off of this hybrid. And those few studies suggest that, well, at the very least, they don't hinder each other, and there may be some positive reason, there may be some good reasons to combine them. I do, in my practice, I think that self-efficacy beliefs, I see those in my patients. I see how they influence my patients' motivation and how they interpret their successes and failures. I see how I can manipulate those sources of information to hopefully strengthen my patients' self-efficacy beliefs, and we'll talk about that in the subsequent lectures. Self-efficacy sounds a lot like competence from self-determination theory, although at a most kind of a basic level with self-efficacy, we're talking about beliefs. And beliefs are, particularly, they're kind of predictions about how I will do. Whereas competence in the self-determination theory perspective is a need that is either satisfied isn't. Okay. But beyond that, I think there is a fair amount of overlap between people's self-efficacy beliefs and whether or not, for example, their need for competence is being satisfied. Right? I can see, for example, a patient who has high self-efficacy beliefs, and in the course of therapy, they make small, gradual improvements. Because in their confidence that they can continue to do better, they will interpret those small, gradual improvements positively as a sign of their capability. And therefore, their need for competence is satisfied. Whereas a patient with low self-efficacy has the same amount of small, gradual improvements. And to them, that is a confirmation that they can't get much better. And now their need for competence has been thwarted, has not been satisfied. And then we have all of the negative effects on motivation and their general psychological well-being, perhaps. Okay, thank you. That's it for this introduction. In the following lectures, we'll talk about a little bit about assessing motivation, but much more discussion on what we can actually do in therapy.